Okay, everyone, it is lovely to have you all here for this webinar about sleep and the particular issues our loved ones with Down syndrome might face in the nighttime hours, or maybe not so nighttime hours to them. So I just want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about who we are, the Down Syndrome Research Foundation. So I hope you will bear with me while I just very quickly introduce us to you in case you've never heard of the Down Syndrome Research Foundation. We have been around for over 20 years. And let me just find the right window. Bear with me. Too many tabs open. Okay, so I am Dr. Liz Corcoran. I am a sibling to David, who has Down syndrome, who is the adult in some of the photos that you've just seen coming by. And he kindly shared his pictures from when he had his sleep study a little while ago. He was very happy to share with other people, but particular the younger people who have to face doing a sleep study as well, and just to show them that it wasn't scary at all, and that actually he's been managing to wear his CPAP machine every night, most nights. So yes, that's why I am involved with Down syndrome and the Down Syndrome Research Foundation. Who are we? We are the UK's only Down syndrome research charity. And our vision is for people with Down syndrome to have a long, healthy, and happy life. And that includes also, we know that the families are impacted as well. So we want, to bring the best scientific research that is needed for the issues that affect our community. So we want to do that by funding and promoting groundbreaking research. We want to improve understanding of Down syndrome. And as well, an important part of what we do is supporting the human rights of people with Down syndrome and their families through advocacy. And you may have heard some of our recent victories. We're very happy about the restarting of the Down syndrome APPG and the Down syndrome bill that's being proposed and moving through Parliament. So we're really, really happy to be a small part of the work that's going on there behind the scenes. So why does research matter? I suppose, for you guys to understand that it has important impacts. Obviously, it means that people with Down syndrome can get evidence-based treatment. There's a lot of questions, and Dr. Hill is going to talk to you today a little bit about where the holes in research are around sleep. But there's lots of other places where we lack good guidance and good evidence on the best treatments for people with Down syndrome when they have particular conditions or problems. We want them to live richer lives. We want them to have the best quality of life. We want them to have healthier lives. So one of the things that I personally do is I talk to local groups. I do talks about nutrition, lifestyle, and sleep's a huge part of that. So that is a big part of what we do as a foundation, is wanting to support sleep research and actually promote understanding of good sleep. And we also, as I said, do advocacy work. We want people with Down syndrome to have choices and to be able to live the life they would want to live. And that includes helping to make sure there's up-to-date research and actually that they have equal rights to research funding. At the moment, you may not be aware that just over £5 per person with Down syndrome per year is spent on research. And we think that's terrible. And we'd like to see that number change. We need to lobby the government to do that, but we also need to mobilize the community to understand why research matters. So I want you to, I suppose, spend a little bit of time just inspiring you guys that particularly this is just one aspect of the sleep that impacts people with Down syndrome. But if I can encourage you guys to get behind the work of the foundation and support research in any way you can, we would just be so, so grateful. So that's my little pitch about what we do. So thank you for listening. So I want to invite up on the stage Dr. Cathy Hill. Welcome, Cathy. Hello. It's so good to
Thank
have you here
you. Thank you
today.
so much. Thank you. I like the idea of the stage.
It's a good way to
sitting,
think about it.
sitting, talking to myself in my office. Actually, it's lovely to see some faces. Thank you, those of you who are brave enough to put your cameras on. It kind of makes it just so much more real than sitting and talking to a screen. So, and just fantastic that so many people have joined, actually. I know when Lizzie proposed this, I had no idea we were going to have so many people interested, and that's great. And I think that speaks volumes about actually how important sleep is to children and to families. And certainly that's my lived experience.
Definitely. Well, just to introduce you, Dr. Hill's down in Southampton. You're an associate professor of child health within the University Medical School there. And obviously, your focus is on sleep, and you definitely have a heart for our community. You've done a few research projects on children with Down syndrome to work on understanding sleep better, and you'd love to do more. And we would love to see that happen. So I will get out of your way and let you begin telling us a little bit about sleep in Down syndrome. So thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that will behave itself. Here we go. I don't need any sound, so that's all good. Are you seeing that okay?
Yes, it's still on display mode, not projector.
Yeah. There we go.
Great.
How's that? Okay. And thank you to the kind parent who shared this beautiful, beautiful photograph of these two gorgeous twin boys. What a lovely image. So I've stolen it and then put it on the header slide because I thought it was such a great image. So thank you, Liz, for that lovely introduction. And as Liz said, I have been really interested in sleep generally, actually, in children with Down syndrome now for a good sort of 10 years. And what I want to do today is to talk really about sleep in general. I mean, when Liz said, let's talk about sleep, I thought, gosh, you know, which bit of the 10 hours of talks am I going to give on this? Because there's so much we could talk about. It's such an interesting area. So I really hope I hit the spot today and focus on things that are relevant to you. My interest, I guess, is very much inspired by my clinical work. So as well as doing research, I'm a pediatrician and I run a sleep clinic, and we have around 500 referrals a year. And in amongst the children we see, of course, are quite a few children with Down syndrome with a variety of different sleep problems. So here we go. Hope you're sitting comfortably. So first of all, I think, you know, sleep is really quite poorly understood. And I think we can't really understand why children have sleep problems and what those problems are about unless we have some fundamental understanding about sleep physiology, just some basics as to what sleep is and what's happening. And, you know, it may not surprise you, but actually even in, you know, medical school, we teach very, very little about sleep. I'm sure this was Liz's experience, certainly my experience. And yet you think about that in the context of children spend half of their breathing hours asleep, you know, so there has to be something jolly important happening in the body and in the brain during that time for us to spend all the time in this sort of level of altered consciousness. So I'm just going to show you a few sort of images really just to cue you in a little bit about some kind of key facts about sleep. And I think most of you will probably appreciate that sleep isn't one thing. It's fundamentally a state of the brain. And it dictates actually your whole body physiology. So depending on what stage of sleep you're in, different things are happening throughout your body with your hormones, with your heart, with your breathing, with your temperature control. You know, it really affects just about every aspect of your bodily functions. And sleep, as I said, isn't one thing. It's a whole series of different brain states. So this is just a little diagram really illustrating what that looks like. So during the night, your brain really takes a journey through the landscape of sleep. So we start off up here, hoping you're seeing my little cursor there on the screen. We're starting in wakefulness at the top, and quite rapidly, this is children that go to sleep easily or adults that fall asleep easily. Off we go into the journey of sleep. And the first bit of sleep we hit quite quickly is our deep sleep. And it's called deep sleep because it's actually hardest to wake up from that. So the number of parents who say to me, you know, it might be a real struggle to get my child to sleep, but you know what, once they're asleep, we know we've got that hour, we've got that precious little hour when they're going to be quiet. And that's because they're sitting there in their deep sleep. Okay, you can see that. And you can see how deep sleep is mostly in the first few hours of the night. So very often parents will say, actually, they're quite settled at the beginning of the night, but then it all changes as the night goes on. And the reason it changes is that as you progress through the night, can you see these sort of red lines here? This is dream sleep. You have more and more dream sleep as the night goes on. And dream sleep, contrary to what people often think, is actually very fragile. You know, it's a sleep you can really easily wake up out of. And that's why we remember our dreams sometimes if we wake up out of them. And as you go through the night, your sleep gets lighter. So stage 3 sleep here is deeper. And as we go up, it's lighter sleep. So basically, as the child goes through a night's sleep, they're more and more likely to wake up. And in fact, we have natural wake-ups about once an hour after our deep sleep is done at the beginning of the night. So a really, really important message is waking up at night is normal. We all do it. We do it multiple times. It's usually quite brief and we don't always remember it. You know, a lot of us might remember kind of waking up, checking the clock. Great, it's 3 o'clock. We might get up and go to the loo, but children do this as well. And a lot of the problems that children have with night waking relate to these natural night wakings that then follow on to a behavior. And we're going to come back onto that in a minute. Another little fact I just want you to grasp at this point is that, do you remember I said everything in your body is different during the different sleep stages? And that includes our kind of muscle control. And an important thing to be aware of is in dream sleep, we switch our muscles off. We effectively become paralyzed from the neck down. So that stops us running around the room and acting our dreams out. And that becomes important when we talk later about sleep apnea, because it means that all of our muscles, including the muscles at the back of our throat, become a little bit floppy. So I'm going to come back to that. So just hold on to that little fact as we go through. Dream sleep equals floppy sleep because we're paralyzed. I think the question I'm probably asked most often by parents is, how much sleep should my child need? And the answer is as much sleep as they need. It's a really difficult one to answer because every child is different. And this is an interesting graphic that shows ideal amounts of sleep. That's the dark blue blobs, kind of what might be okay, and that's the turquoise blobs, and the bit that probably isn't okay, which is the red blobs. And as you can see through life, it changes. So when children are born, newborn, they need a lot of sleep. We all know that, don't we? And as you progress through life into the teenage years, you need less and less sleep. So, you know, pretty typical for a teenager might be about 9 hours. Pretty typical for a school-age child might be around 10 hours. But as you can see, there is huge variation around this. And these figures were not derived from somebody just kind of guessing and plucking numbers out the air. This was reviewing 700 research papers and looking at the associations between how much sleep children had and what happened to them, their physical health, their mental health, their ability to think and stay on task, that kind of thing. So it came from science, and it's not absolute, but it's a kind of guide. So there's a huge amount of variation. And the bottom line is, you know, if your child can ping out of bed in the morning feeling reasonably refreshed and doesn't show signs of tiredness in the day, chances are they're getting enough sleep. But it's quite a tricky one to measure. And of course, what we know with children is, unlike adults, they don't just look sleepy. Quite often they become dysregulated, their behavior goes off, they're more hyperactive, they're more challenging, and that can be a sign of sleepiness in children. So it can be very confusing and very difficult to spot sleepiness in children. Okay. So what makes us go to sleep? Because I think, you know, we all kind of imagine, don't we? It's this kind of magic process. There's like a switch in your brain, you just go to sleep. It feels like it's something that should be natural, something we can just do without really thinking about it. And unsurprisingly, it then becomes very frustrating if we can't or if our children can't. So I just want you to think about some of the key things that have to be right, have to be lined up, if you like, in order to go to sleep. So first of all, your brain has to be ready for sleep. And what does that mean? So that means you have to be tired. And you think, well, this isn't much of a lecture. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's not always obvious to people, you know, and I've come across a lot of parents, particularly when children have, for example, learning disabilities or physical challenges, who might put their child to bed a wee bit too early. And they haven't kind of thought, well, actually, my child's now 15. You know, your typical 15-year-old is now going to bed much later. They're not going to be going to sleep at 7 o'clock anymore in the evening like a younger child might. So, you know, we have to be tired. And that means we have to have been awake for long enough to have that brain urge and brain readiness for sleep. The other thing that's perhaps a little bit less obvious and a kind of silent thing in our brain is our body clock, our endogenous body clock, which sits sort of deep in our brain and tells us when approximately we're wanting to go to sleep. And that peaks at about 3 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, if you've really trying to do all-nighter or you're doing a night shift, that's the time when it's really hardest to stay awake. But if your body clock's completely out, and it can be in some sleep disorders, it's very hard to go to sleep, even if you're actually tired. And that's what happens when we get jet lag. So as well as your brain being ready, we also have to be, of course, relaxed and calm. I think we all know this from lived experience. If you've got any worries, if you go to bed stewing about something the next morning, if you're stressed because you've got to get up early to catch a train or something, it's much harder to fall asleep. And for children, that can be very relevant if they're hyped up or if they're anxious, if they're phobic about school, if they're fearful of things, it's much harder for them to settle to sleep. Physical environment needs to be right, and we're going to talk a bit about what that involves. And of course, you have to be free from pain. And we see a lot of children who have particular sensory needs. So have those sensory needs been met in the run up to bedtime, over the day, and are their sensory needs being met in bed? You have to be the right temperature, not too hot, not too cold. And it helps if you're not hungry. It equally helps if you're not full of food, because a big meal or a big tube feed, for example, just before you go to bed is going to make it much harder. Your body naturally slows down its gut digestion during sleep. So it helps to not have a full tummy when you go to bed. And this is the one that people forget about. We all make a choice to go to bed, don't we? I mean, after about sort of 4 days of trying to stay awake, you lose that choice, you know, it becomes involuntary. But we all make a conscious choice. Now it's time for me to go to bed. So there is a huge cognitive and behavioral aspect about going to sleep. And that is very much true for children as well. And that's where some of the things that you can do can be very, very helpful to help the child be in the right sort of cognitive state of readiness for going to bed. So through the research over the years, what have parents told researchers about children with Down syndrome and their sleep? So there's quite a famous, well-known sleep questionnaire that is often used, and I've pulled all the data, and this is across hundreds of children. These children are more likely to be resistant at bedtime than their non-Down syndrome peers. So resistance is very much about a behavior, not happy to go to bed, not wanting to go to bed, putting up a fight about going to bed. They're more likely to be anxious about going to bed, more likely to wake at night, more likely to have problems with breathing at night, more likely to be restless. I hear this so much. You know, my child is very restless, tossing and turning, throwing the sheets off, upside down, left, back to front, all over the bed, moving around. And also some of that is about rocking at night. More likely to be sleepy in the day. And this is a real red flag because, as I mentioned, children tend to go a little bit hyper before they actually become sleepy. So sleepy children really do tend to be properly sleep-deprived children. There's been some studies that have actually then used what I call objective measures. So used equipment and actually monitoring to look at sleep and look at what's different about sleep, if anything, in children with Down syndrome. And what those research studies have shown. So first of all, thinking about actigraphy, this is the fancy medical word for a kind of Fitbit, if you like, that you wear at night or that the child wears at night that measures movement, and it downloads into fancy software so we can kind of guess when the child's asleep and when they're awake. And what we see is shorter sleep, poorer quality sleep, so a lot more interruptions of sleep and more night wakings. When we put children into sleep laboratories, so that's when we're looking at brain waves, we're looking at sleep states and sleep stages. The data isn't very consistent, to be honest. What I mean by that is some studies say one thing and some studies say completely the opposite. But there's a little bit of a common thread running through this, and that is that if there is one feature that perhaps is seen more consistently, and that is less dream sleep. Okay, I'll come back to that later. Some of you might be asking why that is. Okay, so are we bothered? I mean, every parent that can't get a good night's sleep is bothered and doesn't need to be told. This is important because you know yourself what it feels like not to sleep. But there is some fabulous research out there now in children that tells us why sleep is important for child development and for child health. I could spend hours talking about it. I'm just going to give you some headlines, if you like. So this is data in typically developing children. And there've been some really smart studies. There's a word for this. It's called experimental studies. This is when you take a group of children and you expose them to sleep restriction. So they have a few nights when they don't have enough sleep, and they have some nights when they have normal sleep, and you spot the difference. So you're taking the same child and you're comparing the difference between good sleep and bad sleep. And those studies have shown that children very rapidly, even over about 3 days, and I'm not talking about crazy all-nighters, I'm just talking about maybe having about 45 minutes less sleep a night, so quite a small amount. It very rapidly shows in things like how well the child can stay on task and pay attention, how well they can control their behavior and their emotions, and how restless and impulsive they are in the day. And that's a really small amount of sleep deprivation. So you think about that over a long period of time, what that does to children and their ability to learn in class, for example, if they're restless and they can't pay attention. And then if you follow children up over time, we know that there's a whole load of stuff that can happen. So we know you're much more likely to be overweight and obese if you have short sleep, and even short sleep in early childhood. We did some studies here in Southampton looking at children when they were 3 and looking at some very fancy measures of body fat mass. And children that weren't sleeping enough at 3 were much more likely to have a lot more fat in their body at the age of 6. And there's been some stunning data in long-term studies that have shown that it might even be that not having enough sleep in the early years can affect how your grey matter, your kind of clever brain, develops. And that's very new data and very exciting and interesting data, because, you know, if there was one kind of reason why children should sleep, it's to do with their brain development. And I think we have to kind of ask ourselves, don't we, why do little babies sleep so much? You know, what's going on that means that babies need to sleep so much and we need to sleep less and less as we get older? And it probably is related to brain development. But what about children with Down syndrome? Well, as Liz said, you know, I think it's often the case, isn't it, that the research sort of follows. It follows later. You know, it's harder to get funding for this kind of research. I have to say, from my own experience, we have had absolutely fantastic support from parents. That has never been an issue. So actually, you know, once you get the funding and you get a project up and going, we've had some really fabulous support from parents in the past, volunteering their children to take part in research, which is great. So what do we know? We know that, I've just got all of your lovely images in the way there. We know that there's an association in little children. This was some fabulous work from Arizona, with short sleep and both daytime behaviors and things like language development. So the studies, you know, compared to the thousands of children that have been studied without Down syndrome, it's really low numbers still, looking at how it impacts on daytime well-being and daytime behavior. But I've always argued, you know, children with Down syndrome have got less what we call cognitive reserve to call on. You know, if you already start off with some element of learning challenges and then you throw another challenge in, like not getting enough sleep, you haven't got as much reserve there. So if anything, we would expect that if we were able to do the same amount of research as has been done in typically developing children, I think those effects might even be greater. Okay, so what's going on? We've talked about sleep, you know, parents telling us there's problems, children not sleeping as long, children waking up more. What's this all about? What are the reasons for it? Because we have to find a cause, don't we? You can only really manage something and treat it if you know what the cause is. So in sleep medicine, we work to this classification. And just to give you a little bit of an insight, really, because people just think, my child has a sleep problem, I need to fix the sleep problem. They don't think, well, what's causing the sleep problem? And actually, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why. And when I teach doctors about sleep, I say, you know, if you have a cough, you don't treat the cough. You try and find out, is it asthma? Is it a chest infection? Is it a tickly throat? They're all very different and they all have different treatments. And exactly the same is true for sleep disorders. So these are the kind of things that we're looking at. So breathing problems at night, we've talked about that already. Insomnia, difficulties falling asleep and difficulties staying asleep. It's in pink because I'm going to talk about that next. Being too sleepy in the day, so things like narcolepsy, rare disorders. Parasomnias, so things like sleep terrors, sleepwalking, where your body clock isn't working properly. We call those circadian rhythm disorders, and movement disorders and sleep. So, you know, the trick, and I guess the sort of what I've spent my time doing, is trying to unpick, you know, what's going on, because a lot of these things present in exactly the same way. Can't go to sleep, can't stay asleep, too tired in the day. And all of these things may potentially be involved in that. So I'm going to talk first of all about insomnia. The reason I'm talking about this is it is the commonest sleep disorder we see in children. Okay, you can bet your bottom dollar that no matter what the underlying developmental issues are, no matter what the underlying medical problems might be, insomnia is very often part of what we're seeing. And there is one that might be familiar with you when I start to tell the story, and this is the commonest insomnia that we see, and it's got a very kind of fancy long name, sleep onset association disorder. And the concept behind this is that every single one of us on this planet learns to fall asleep or has a preference for falling asleep in a very particular environment. Just stop and think for a second. When you settle yourself down to sleep, and in those kind of 10, 15 minutes before you go to bed, I bet you do something rather similar every night. Okay, most of you will have a habit. You'll like, you know, you'll like your bedroom a certain way, you'll like the lighting a certain way, some of you will want the radio on, you'll probably put yourself into a particular position in bed. And once that's all good, it makes it a wee bit easier to fall asleep. You've learned that association. And most of us in the Western world have pillows, don't we? That's a kind of cultural thing we do, not all over the world, but we tend to have a pillow. So good, all fine. You're in your bed, you've got your pillow, you settle down to sleep. Imagine you wake up after your natural night waking here, big blue arrow. So you've fallen asleep, everything's good. You've got your pillow, you've got whatever you like to go to sleep. You have your first natural night waking. We all do it. We do it probably every hour after this nice chunk of deep sleep. And your pillow's gone. You're not going to go back to sleep. You're going to feel quite anxious. Things will feel strange. Your bed will feel odd. You're not going to go back to sleep. And this is the idea behind sleep onset association disorder. Okay, so a lot of parents and children develop a sort of habit around settling the child to sleep. And I've done it as a parent, and lots of parents I see do it. You know, we put a lot of effort into getting our child to sleep, and that might mean rocking, cuddling, soothing, musical toys, you know, ceiling lights, warm milk, all of these things. And they work. You know, they often work fantastically well. The child goes to sleep beautifully. Problem is, when you have that first night waking, the rocking isn't there anymore. You know, the music isn't there anymore. The lights aren't there anymore. It's all gone. So you're not going to be able to fall asleep again because your metaphorical pillow has gone. And so what does the child do? I'm not comfortable. I can't go back to sleep. This isn't how I fall asleep. So they're going to shout and call for mum or dad or come out the room or whatever. And the parent's going to go in and do the whole thing all over again. Now, that might sound familiar to some of you, but it is the commonest sleep disorder we see. And so one of the simple tools of the trade, and I think every single parent at antenatal classes should be taught about this, is at the right time in a child's development. And it can happen as late as teenage years. It's never too late. But ideally, when the child is young, you get in there early and you encourage and help the child to learn to self-soothe themselves to sleep. And then once they've learnt that trick at the beginning of the night, and it should be lovely, you know, settling to sleep should be a lovely process. It doesn't have to be harsh, doesn't have to be scary. In fact, it absolutely shouldn't be. It should be a nice, soothing process. But the point is that the child settles in their bed independently, sleepy, but not quite asleep yet. And the parent, hopefully, by that point is outside the room, assuming you don't want to co-sleep. And if you want to co-sleep, that's absolutely fine. That's your choice. But I guess it's kind of quite culturally common, isn't it, in the UK for people to want their children to sleep independently. But I'm a big believer in flexibility. You know, every family and every culture is different, so you'll all have your own views. But I think understanding this little trick and this little association is kind of very helpful and can be a big clue for people to move forwards. The other type is the limit setting type, and they often kind of mix up a little bit actually. So in this one, instead of lots of wakings, children also struggle to fall asleep, and parents will say, you know, it's a nightmare getting this child to bed. You know, they're screaming and shouting, and they might be sick, they might be really upset, they're up and down the stairs, they're really very unhappy about going to bed. And the same will happen if they wake up at night. So the problem's at both ends. And, you know, we're all human, aren't we? And actually children respond to consistency. And isn't it difficult to be in real life? In real life, isn't it hard to be consistent, especially if you're exhausted? And so what often happens, we call this kind of like the gambling phenomena. You know, that idea that, you know, the old fashioned slot machines, fruit machines, you know, if the third time you pull the handle on the fruit machine, all the money pours out, you're going to think fantastic, and you're going to keep playing, aren't you? So, you know, if a child is really, really unhappy about going to bed, and this isn't an anxious child or an ill child. This is a child who's feisty and strong and really knows that they can put up a good fight. And if they put up a good fight, they're going to get what they want. If they get what they want, they're going to keep putting up that fight, because they know that if they keep pulling the handle, in other words, keep asking, they'll get what they want. And that is so difficult for parents that are very tired, but consistency around approaching this is terribly important. Okay, so we did some research a few years ago, and we were lucky enough to have a fantastic group of parents, almost 202 actually, just over 202 families across the country in Southampton. So it was based in Southampton Children's Hospital, Sheffield, and the Evelina. And some of you may have been involved in that study. We were looking at sleep and looking at breathing, particularly in sleep. And we had a group of infants and toddlers. So these were children under 2 years, 104 families, all completed a questionnaire about sleep behaviors. And we were able to compare them to a wonderful group of it was a wonderful study conducted by a woman in Brown University in the US, a psychologist, who'd gathered data in the UK. And this was the really important thing. We wanted UK children that we could compare to our group of children with Down syndrome. And she had a big group of 489 children where families had answered exactly the same questionnaire, and we could match by gender and we could match by age and look at the differences. And parents told us about how their child slept and how they settled their child to sleep, both at the beginning of the night and if they woke up during the night. And what we found was that the children with Down syndrome had some really striking differences. So first of all, parents were much more likely to say they had sleep problems, 45% of parents compared to 19% of the non-Down syndrome children. Much more likely to have snoring. That was no big surprise, because we know that's an issue. But the really shocking thing for me was that they had 55 minutes less sleep at night than their typically developing peer. And do you remember I was saying 45 minutes, you see really big differences in children. 55 minutes is a big difference. And what was happening was they were shifting some of their nighttime sleep into the day, so they were having more day naps. But even if you added on the day naps to try and bulk out how much sleep they were getting in 24 hours, they were still having almost 40 minutes less sleep. So this was a real difference, we felt, in total sleep time. And they were much more likely to have problems. That OR means odds ratio. It's a fancy bit of statistics, but for simplicity, I'll say approximately twice as likely to have problems settling to sleep. So then there's the big why question, isn't there? Why was this? Now, the study was just observational, so we couldn't truly answer that in any detail, but we could get some clues from how parents answered the questionnaires. So hopefully I can get my slide on. Here we go. So we asked about how parents were settling their child to sleep. And just bear in mind that thing I talked about, the pillow analogy, you know, that situations that are there in the room when you fall asleep, you need to have there again when you wake up in the night. So the parents of children with Down syndrome in the study were more likely to bottle feed their child to sleep. This would have been the younger children, almost 5 times as likely. Much more likely, almost 6 times as likely to be rocking their child or holding their child, to have a parent alongside, so the child was in their bed but the parent was lying next to them, or to be in the parent's bed to settle to sleep. And so we kind of put all that stuff together and said, well, how much more likely were parents to be kind of with their child at the point the child settled to sleep? And it was 4 times, or a bit more than 4 times more likely. So, you know, the non-Down syndrome children, about 25% of parents were still quite involved in settling, because these are young children, remember, but it was much more striking in the children with Down syndrome. So that was kind of interesting. So I guess the received wisdom, if you look at all the medical literature, there's a bit of a simple kind of interpretation of this. People think, well, okay, the biggest problem in children with Down syndrome is this sleep apnea thing. We all know about that. So surely all the sleep problems to do with sleep apnea. And that's where most of the research has been. But this study kind of said something slightly different, actually, in terms of explaining why we were seeing these problems with this shorter sleep. Remember that number of 40 minutes less sleep across the 24 hours. We looked to see whether snoring explained the difference, because if this was all a sleep apnea problem, okay, we know what we're dealing with. We can manage that. We can do something about that. Snoring didn't affect any aspects of sleep other than night waking, which you would expect. Okay, so children that snored a lot were more likely to wake up, and that was true for all children. But whether or not the mum or dad were there when the child settled to sleep explained later bedtimes, more frequent and longer night wakings, shorter periods of uninterrupted sleep. That's a kind of a funny concept, isn't it? But we know now that the more kind of consolidated sleep you have, the better your sleep is. And no compensatory increase in day naps. And actually, once we'd kind of looked at this, it actually explained an hour less of sleep overall. And this was true across the children. So if the parents were very engaged in the child settling to sleep, those children had around an hour less sleep overall. So is that chicken or is that egg? Because, you know, I kind of talked to you about the sleep onset association, and, you know, it sounds a bit like I'm pointing the finger of blame, doesn't it? You know, how you settle your child to sleep means they don't get so much sleep. But of course, it could be the other way around. You know, if you've got a child that's very difficult to settle inherently for some other reason, you're going to respond in a different way. You know, and I think an interesting, you know, quite often I'll see children where there are multiple siblings in the family, and this particular child, for whatever reason, is different. So, you know, all children have different personalities and different temperaments and different needs, and that can drive how, you know, the kind of dance, if you like, between the parent and child, and how those behaviors play out in the night. So we don't know that from this research. It wasn't designed to tell us that one way or another. But if we look at the other literature, in typically developing children, we absolutely know that parent behavior at bedtime will affect how a child settles and how a child manages their natural night wakings. And we know, as I've mentioned, that all of those lovely strategies like rocking and very, what I think of as effortful settling, you know, working hard to get your child to sleep, they're really effective. They get the child to sleep, but the child hasn't learned that magic skill to self-soothe at night and struggles then when they wake up. And as I've said, all of these things are, it sounds very simple, but actually in real life it's more complex, isn't it? Because we all have our cultural norms, you know, how you were settled as a child, the kind of routine that you had, your beliefs about your child. You know, if I think a really powerful, important belief is if you see your child as unwell or fragile, or if they are unwell, you know, if you've had a child who's had a really difficult first year of life, if they've had cardiac surgery, if you've had a really difficult, stressful time, it's damn difficult to sort of switch the light off and say, night, night, I'm sorry, you know, time for bed now. That is very difficult to do. And it's much more human and natural to want to you know, cradle and rock your child. So these things are quite complex. And as I said, it'll really depend on a child's temperament as well. And they're all different, aren't they? And of course, we know as well that children with Down syndrome are at more risk of things like autism spectrum disorder and problems like ADHD. And those things all have independent impacts on sleep and bedtime. Okay. But just to give you a little bit of a kind of positive on this, you know, there are some beautiful research projects out there that are looking at ways of managing insomnia in children with neurodevelopmental differences. Most of the work so far has been in children with autism spectrum disorder and children with ADHD. And there have been much smaller projects in children with Down syndrome, but there are some projects out there. that have looked at approaches, what we call psychoeducation approaches, so working with parents to promote good sleep habits and teach people different tricks of the trade, if you like, to try and manage some of these really tricky situations at bedtime. And they do work. They do work. And there's been different ways of doing it. You know, some people do it with a therapist, some people do it with an online website or a digital intervention. And there's been enough work in children with autism that somebody's been able to lump all the research together in something called a meta-analysis. That's just a fancy scientific way of putting all the data together and seeing if there's a truth in amongst the data. And those sort of analyses show that these interventions genuinely do work in children with autism. And certainly from my clinical experience, there are a lot of gains that can be made from these approaches as well in children with Down syndrome. So I just wanted to skip through some facts really about what we call sleep hygiene, or what we like to call more commonly now good sleep habits. So what are the simple things that we can do that help all of us sleep? Bedtime routines. It sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? It sounds pretty obvious, but it is the bedrock. It is so, so, so important. Children really benefit from that stepwise sequence of events leading up to bedtime. And the more rigid and the more same it is, the better for the child. And I've got some pictures there of, you know, visual timetables. These things are great for children. Countdown timers so that they know they've got, you know, 10 minutes before bed or whatever. And it's based on sort of classic psychological theory. You learn to associate a sequence of activities with what's going to happen next. And I think, you know, we have to remember none of us make a sudden transition very easily, do we? We like a little bit of preparation. We like to know what's coming next. We like to prepare ourselves for change. And children are very much the same. And, you know, if you could make that a positive time as well, and I think most people do intuitively make bedtime a positive time, whether it's a bit of one-to-one time, a bit of quiet time, a bit of story time, you know, whatever the child enjoys. So special, it might be massage, you know, there's all kinds of things that children like. Everybody knows their own child best of all. And building those into the bedtime routine can be very helpful. And we tend to say, you know, start that journey to bed about an hour before, and using signals and cues that your child understands. And keeping it calm is very important, nothing too exciting. Things that children do in the day help sleep as well. And we know now that exercise is helpful. And the more the better, to be honest. So this was a study of school-aged children, a big study of almost 600 children. Every hour a child sat down in the day meant they took 3 minutes longer to fall asleep at night. So the more active you can get your children, the more likely they are to fall asleep. And this is what the UK CMOs are recommending now. It's quite interesting. More than 3 hours for preschoolers a day, more than an hour a day for 5 to 11-year-olds. So I think thinking about where we can get that in, it might just be walking home from school rather than taking the car, you know, just building it in. Active time outside and in daylight actually as well is really helpful for children wherever you can get it. Thinking about children's diet, people don't always realize where caffeine sneaks into food, and caffeine is the best way to keep your child asleep. And it can last in your blood and in your system for about 6 hours. So think about your child's bedtime. We really strongly recommend avoiding things like chocolate or fizzy drinks that have caffeine in. Tea and coffee, people know, have caffeine in, but look how much you need. So an average 5-year-old, 25 milligrams is enough to stop them going to sleep. A 28-gram bar of dairy milk, and they've had 15 milligrams. Yeah. So a can of Coca-Cola, they've had twice as much as that. So it sneaks in and you don't always realize. And there's a big myth, isn't there, around hot chocolate's great for children at bedtime. So we tend to say, if you can, if your child's struggling to settle to sleep, really be rigorous and try and avoid caffeine wherever you can. The bedroom environment, so keeping it about the right temperature, not too hot, not too cold. 18 degrees is perfect. Keeping it quiet. And the thing with noise is it's sudden unexpected noises or changes in the background noise that tend to wake us up at night. So a continual noise, often we just acclimatise to. So children get used to a road noise or a rail track near the house, things that they're familiar with, you know, the drone of aeroplanes overhead. We don't tend to wake up once we're used to those things, but sudden noises like a telephone ringing or a voice, this sort of thing will wake children up. Dark is so important. Okay, so the journey to bedtime, get those lights dimmed. If you've got a child that's afraid of the dark, that's very common. Try to use a night light and try to have an orange or red night light, not a white one. Okay, because white light or blue light stop our body making the sleepy hormone melatonin. And screens, of course, all those lovely tablets that we've got now, phones, TV screens, they spit out blue light and they stop our bodies making melatonin. Melatonin just helps ease us into sleep, and it's incredibly important. So dim light and red light, or plug-in orange lights if your child wants a bit of light to reassure them at night. I think we all kind of intuitively know that a bed is helpful, and being comfortable and being horizontal is helpful. Although, in some cultures, people sleep semi-seated. There's all kinds of different ways of doing it, but most of us like to sleep horizontally. Not too stimulating. I think often we make the mistake as parents to think, my child's not sleeping, I've got to make the bedroom nicer. If the bedroom's nice, if I paint the walls this way, or if there's, nice toys in there, if it's a lovely place, then my child will sleep. And of course, it's a kind of confusing message sometimes for a child. So actually a boring bedroom is the best kind of bedroom really to sleep in. And safety, of course, is really, really important. If you've got a child that might climb out the window, you want window locks. If you've got a child that might run around with a night terror or a sleepwalking, you want to make sure the house is nice and safe. And we tend to say, if your child struggles to understand bedtime, if your child has learning disabilities that makes that difficult to understand, I think having a bedroom that's also a play center in the day is really confusing. That, you're going to this space again, but now you've got to do something different. So we tend to say to parents, if your home doesn't have the capacity to separate out that space, put the toys in a little box and wheel it out. So all those tempting things aren't there anymore. Just comfort toys that children might need to sleep is all that's needed. And just to make you think, there's a wonderful book, Where Children Sleep Around the World, and just look at some of these images. So that's an example of a bedroom that's not great for sleep. Stuffed full of toys and entertainment. So, would you go to sleep in there? I think you'd be kind of challenging, wouldn't it really? And this one, if you kind of have a quick squint around, look at all the electronics. A lot of electronics in the bedroom. We know that electronics have huge benefits for children in terms of learning, and lots of children are really soothed by electronics. But as I say, we do have this real problem of blue light and accessibility. If it's there at 3 a.m. when you wake up, it's too tempting, isn't it, to want to hop on and have a look. And it's very tempting as parents to think, well, okay, it soothes the child, everybody gets a night's sleep, let's leave it be. So I think we have a real challenge in this day and age, don't we, around accessible tablets and electronics. And I'm just putting that up there because, there's an increasing vogue, isn't there, for sleep pods. And actually, as intelligent adults, people pay money to pop into these. This is actually all you need, isn't it? In real life, that's all you need to sleep. A dark, safe, comfortable space. So have a little bit of a think about what we're doing sometimes to our children's bedrooms. And, for many children, safety sleepers, and there's a whole bunch and variety of them out there, can be a really helpful way of keeping a child safe at bedtime, and actually giving a beautiful, clear message. This is your lovely, safe sleep space. This is where you go to sleep. It's not a play space. So for some children, that kind of a sleep space can be very helpful. Screens I've talked about, I won't labour this, but there's loads of data now showing that more time on screens, even in toddlers and preschoolers, it knocks their nighttime sleep and they take longer to fall asleep. And in school-aged children, they're more likely to be sleepy in the day and to not have enough sleep at night. It's not a kind of myth. It's not kind of, PC goody two-shoes people saying keep your children off screens. It really does make a difference. So we've really got to find that delicate balance, haven't we, between all the wonderful, wonderful benefits of screens and keeping the time reasonable. And it might be because sometimes children are using the screens instead of going to sleep. It might be that they're too stimulating at bedtime, but we know that light has a big effect. I think we do have to pay a little bit of attention to things like pain, medical problems like gastroesophageal reflux. If a child's refluxing up their tummy contents and they've got a sore gullet, that's going to make it hard when you lie down flat. Is your child hungry? Has your child sort of had their sensory needs met? These are all important questions to ask. So here we go. It's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it, sleep? So to do it well, we've got to be in the right environment, or it helps at the very least. But that's the bedroom environment, but also the child's internal environment. You know, are they calm? Are they comfortable? Are they free of pain? Are they satiated but not too full of food? You need to be tired, that's self-evident, and your body clock needs to be on the right time zone. And once all those things are all beautifully lined up, you've actually got to make a positive choice to go to bed, because you can make a positive choice not to. We can all decide not to go to bed on any one particular night, even if we're absolutely dead dog tired. Okay, so I haven't got a clock that I can see on my screen, so I'm a little bit conscious of time, and we've got some lovely presentations to come as well. So I'm going to be really speedy, I think, and just tell you a little bit about sleep apnea. I know Liz is going to focus a bit more on this, but for those of you who are not familiar with this, just a little bit of an explanation. At the moment, whilst we're awake, all of you are keeping your upper airway open. So upper airway, I mean from your lips to your Adam's apple. The reason it's open and allowing air to flow beautifully and freely is because your muscles are working. Those muscles are nice and functional. Okay, so air moves through, and you can see somebody lying on their back there. Air's moving through beautifully. When you fall asleep, those muscles relax. Now, for most of us, it's a nice big space. It doesn't matter, the muscles relax, the air's still flowing through beautifully. However, if there's anything about your makeup, about the way your face is structured, if you've got a big tongue, if you've got big adenoids or tonsils, which lots of little children do have, or if you're just a little bit extra floppy, or if you're a little bit overweight and your throat's a bit squeezed because of fat layers in your neck, all of these things can make that flop down a little bit more. And if it flops down a little bit more, you snore. So snoring is just because that airway is a little bit too floppy and a bit too shut. Snoring in of itself is probably okay for most of the time, but then occasionally it just flops down completely, and that's called sleep apnea. So it's completely flop shut, and you can see that that space has gone, that nice space there where the air goes through has gone. And our bodies and brains are quite clever, because obviously having that shut for too long is not a great idea, because you're not getting air in, you're not getting oxygen in. So what tends to happen is your brain says, hang on a minute, you need to wake up. Your muscles come back into action, and the airway opens again. And that's called obstructive sleep apnea. And children with Down syndrome have certain increased risk factors compared to non-Down syndrome children. So part of it is around facial shape that can make them a little bit more vulnerable. If you're a little bit more floppy anyway, that makes you more vulnerable. If you put weight on, and this is true for all children, it makes you more vulnerable. And of course, children are children, and adenoids and tonsils, which sit here, can you see is a nice open airway? See that black line? This is just a scan looking cross-sectionally through the head. So you see a lovely open airway down there. Here's a nice big chunky adenoid at the back of your nasal passage. That's the palate there, and that's the tongue. And here's a nice big tonsil. And can you see they're just blocking that airway right up? So, and here's a little chappy with nice big juicy red tonsils. And children grow their tonsils from the age of 2, and they shrink down usually by the time they're about 8, and they just fill that space up, and often that is the cause of sleep apnea in many children. Okay, so what do we look out for? Snoring, that's the cardinal sign. And what happens when you have an apnea is you're snoring away, and then as a parent you'll hear it stop. The snoring stops, there's a little bit of a pause, the brain's waking up, the muscles are kicking in, and you suddenly get a sort of big gasping noise. So parents will say they're hearing this gasping noise at night. Sleep is, it tends to be more restless. It might be associated with bedwetting or difficulties becoming dry at night. Children are often quite sweaty. They may sleep with a head right back in funny positions to try and keep that airway open. Some children will sleep kind of flop forwards with their sort of legs open, so you're kind of putting your head down, so that takes the tongue away from the back of the throat. And in the morning they might have a headache or a dry mouth, so they might do a lot of drinking at night. Often they're mouth breathing during the night, so you'll get a sort of Darth Vader-y sort of breathing noise, a noisy breathing if you like, during the night. So a bit of a problem with this, these symptoms are all present at night. And do you remember that first graph where I showed you the red lines of the dream sleep where children are more vulnerable to this? That really happens more as the night goes on. So often 3, 4, 5 in the morning when everybody else hopefully is asleep. So parents often aren't aware of this, of what's actually going on. And the problem is the impact on the daytime is really non-specific. It might affect children's learning, development, ability to pay attention, all that stuff I talked about earlier that can happen in the day. But none of that says to you, my child's got sleep apnea. It just says, you know, my child's having a bit of a struggle managing their behavior or whatever. You might not know that the child's got sleep apnea. And you take your child to the doctor and they look fine. You know, there's nothing to see because they're awake. And we know that if you examine a child, you can look at their tonsils, but actually the size of the tonsils is not a great predictor of sleep apnea. So I think, you know, the golden message here, the main message is the only way we know is a sleep study. No doctor can tell you your child doesn't have sleep apnea unless they do a sleep study. You have to have a sleep study to know. So that, I think, is the main message, and that's the message we've been trying to get out. And the research that we've been doing is really sort of thinking about how can you do that best in the UK? How can we do that within the NHS? And how often should we be doing it? You know, in America, they say do it once up to your 5th birthday, and then you're probably fine. Just ask the questions every year. And at the moment, we're trying to promote a sort of annual simple screening for children because children can develop it later. You know, you can have it at any age and stage, particularly if a child puts weight on. Okay, so if you've got it, what do you do about it? So this is what the European guidelines suggest for all children. The first most important thing is if a child's overweight, then weight loss can really help because pressure from fat in the neck pushes on the airway. So if you can reduce weight, that's helpful in lots of ways, but certainly can be very helpful for apnea. Sometimes if the nose is very inflamed, then nasal sprays can help if your child's got a really blocked, snuffly nose. I guess the mainstay of treatment is removing those tonsils and adenoids and trying to open that space up a little bit. There are some fancy things that can be done as well. There are some surgical approaches that can kind of change either the tongue or the sort of facial structure. And there are some appliances that can be used to sort of keep the jaw forward at night and keep the mouth open. And then a more common approach, if children either can't have adenotonsillectomy or have had it and it hasn't worked, is to use CPAP therapy. And I'm not going to talk about that now because I know Lizzie is going to talk about that afterwards. But that's where children wear a mask to bed. There was a lovely picture of David with his mask, wasn't there, at the beginning, that actually blasts a little bit of air into the nose and mouth and just splints the airway open. So it's a really simple idea. All you're doing is putting a little bit of pressure in that airway to sort of hold it against the muscles that are trying to flop down. So that's called CPAP, or continuous positive airway pressure. And one of the things that we have been doing over the past year, very generously supported by the Down Syndrome Research Foundation, is doing a big review of the literature. So we've looked at all the research studies out there, spent a lot of time looking at what's a good quality one, what's a bad quality one, merging all the data and saying, do you know how well does adenotonsillectomy really work in children with Down syndrome? How well does CPAP really work? And so we've got some very exciting data there that we're just finessing to send off for review for a journal to be hopefully published in the not too distant future. And I can tell you the headline from it is, we need more data and we don't really know. There hasn't been a single gold standard decent trial, which is quite shocking when you think that, you know, we are currently Europe-wide and, you know, worldwide recommending adenotonsillectomy in children. It definitely helps quite a few children, but it doesn't help all children. And we need to be much, much smarter about how we treat this. And we desperately need a proper randomized, what we call a randomized control trial, where children are allocated by chance to get one treatment or another, so we can work out which is the right treatment for which children. So I think that's a very exciting next step. So just in summary, sleep problems overall affect about 85% of children with Down syndrome. So if your child has had a sleep problem or is having a sleep problem, you are certainly not alone. Just remember, a sleep problem is a symptom, and it could be a lot of different sleep disorders. A Obstructive sleep apnea is super common. So we're estimating approximately 65% of children overall will have some degree of sleep apnea, but it's not the whole explanation. And I strongly sort of feel, you know, children with Down syndrome are children first, and things that affect other children will affect children with Down syndrome too. And behavioral insomnias that I talked about are very common in my experience and can be prevented, I think, with early intervention, and can certainly be helped. And I think quite often that does need support and expert help. It can be quite a difficult, challenging one to do alone. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I hope I haven't horribly overshot. I often tend to get a bit overexcited and go on for too long. So apologies if I've taken up too much time from my colleagues. So I think probably you're going to want to sort of shoot straight on, Liz, are you, to the next speakers?
Yes, we will save the questions until the end.
Great.
I think we're going to welcome your research fellow up. Rina, I hope you're ready. I'm going to add a spotlight. If you're happy to, there we go, great. Just to introduce Rina, Dr. Rina Cianfaglione is a research fellow in Cathy's team, and we're very pleased to have you on the team and working to try and answer some of these questions. And you're going to present just a little snapshot of what you've discovered around parent experiences so far. And then after that, I know some of the adults, some of the parents are waiting to hang on to hear about adults. Don't worry, you're coming up next. So handing over to you, Rina. Thank you. You're on mute.
Okay, so thank you, Liz. Thank you for the lovely introduction. So I think my presentation, it kind of will follow quite nicely from Cathy's presentation, because she mentioned about the needs for more research on sleep apnea in children with Down syndrome, and the need for more clinical, kind of more randomized clinical trials to understand sleep apneas in children. And then what we've been doing, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a small project that the Down Syndrome Research Foundation kindly supported me to conduct, to really look at parents' perspective on changes after treatment for obstructive sleep apneas, and really what matters for the families and the children after they had the treatment. And I just wanted very quickly, oh, sorry, I don't have it on presentation view. Sorry about this, my computer is gonna be, oh, there you go, it's that better, sorry. So we did what we call a public and participant involvement project. And what does that mean? That we basically involve the, in this case, the parents that had experience in the condition we are looking to research, and then to help us to understand some key issues, and then to help us to improve the quality of the research that we are trying to conduct, really. So, and what we did, we asked the parents, and we wanted to hear from parents' view of the treatment of the child that received for obstructive sleep apnea. And then what we were interested is to hear about what got better and what changed after the children's sleep apnea was treated. And what we did, we designed a very short parent survey, and some of you may have seen this survey on the web, on some of the Down syndrome support groups. And then following the parents survey, we've invited few parents to take part in some discussion groups. Well, really, we had a really open, there were kind of focus group where we asked the parents about the child, whether they had sleep apnea, whether they had treatment, what they seen changed before and after the treatment. And then we had a virtual post-board room called Padlet. I'm not sure if you have come across this before. I have put the links in there, and I'm happy to share the links with you, Liz, that you might want to share it with the parents that they might want to add some comment in there. And then really what we were interested again is to to see the parents' opinion on what changes they've noticed after the treatment for sleep apnea. And really the other part, it was asking the opinion again about deciding which treatments they would choose if they were given the choice for sleep apnea. So I'm just gonna really kind of show you what we did, and then this is from the survey. So we asked about whether the child had has or now or had sleep apnea. We were interested to know about if the child had the treatments for sleep apnea and how this was treated. And we were interested to know about the outcomes of the treatment, whether this was successful and what changes they have noticed, and if was not successful, why is that, and what area really they are still struggling as a family, and what area the child is struggling. And here is just like a snapshot of the survey that we've circulated. So in terms of treatment and outcomes, so we had quite a few parents that they completed the survey, and to the question about has your child has now or had sleep apnea in the past, quite the kind of nearly 90% answered yes. And there was a small percentage that they were not sure about sleep apnea, whether the child had a sleep apnea. And then we were interested to know whether the treatment, whether the child had a treatment for sleep apnea, and again, quite a higher percentage of had sleep apnea treated. And this is just really, sorry, I just want to move something. So this is just really a kind of a graph quickly just to show you what the parents told us, and then you can see the vast majority said that the child had adenotonsillectomy followed by CPAP and Montelukast tablets, BiPAP, and others treatment. And these were things like antihistamine or nasal spray of other treatment. So as I said, what we were interested with this small project is really to understand what really matters for the family when the sleep apnea is treated. And really we wanted to know the parents' view on treatment, and specifically again understand the experience on changes and what got better. So and this is data that we've collected through the survey, the discussion groups, and the Padlet virtual board. And these I've just really did a very simple thematic analysis. And these are really the themes that were more evident from the analysis. So what got better was parents talked about the breathing, more daytime engagement. They've seen a lot of improvement in behavior, communication and concentration for the child. And quality of sleep was better for the child and the family. And in general, kind of benefit on general health for the child. And on these slides, I'm sorry, it's quite busy, but I've just put some quotes from what the parents really told us. And as you can see, there is a lot about snoring, more silent sleeping. The child is able to breathe better when laid flat. There is less snoring, and really no choking or gasping in sleep, like what Cathy said earlier. So a lot of the children, they can't breathe, though you can try to get that hair in, and it's quite worrying for the parents when your child, you know, can't sleep, stops breathing. And this is lots of parents commented on that. easier to eat and swallow and less congestions. There were comments on about the child being physically stronger and able to walk for a longer period of time. And lots of comments about better gross motor skills, behavior, improvement in language and the speech and the way they can communicate their needs really. And then the children sleep through the night as well as the whole family, and really less disturbance during the night. So this is, again, were just quotes from parents. But so there was a small percentage also that said the things did not go very well. And some of the parents, they said they don't know why the treatment did not work. The child might need more kind of sleep study to understand why it didn't work. And for the children that they were treated with CPAP, a lot of the issues is compliance and tolerance of the mask on the face. So like keeping the mask on during the night. Some parents commented on the fact that the mask were irritating the face of the child, the noise of the machine. So all of these, they were all factors that affect the compliance and tolerance. But then some parents said that there were some improvements, but still the child had some symptoms like being restless, still tired, and some snoring at night. But really, what does this mean, and what that means kind of matters for the family, really? This was what was all about this small project. Really, and there are, from what we gather from the data, is that there are areas that are very important for families and the child, things like sleep quality, improvement in sleep and sleep. And we know that with polysomnographic studies, you get all of the sleep data, and you can see that it gets better. But really, what does that mean? And then going back to Cathy's comment at the end that we need to design a better clinical trials. We also need to think about what does all these data means and what other area we should be looking to assess. So, and we need to find out really the right outcome measures that in a way they matters to us as researchers, because we need to understand what changes before and after, but also they need to be the data we collect needs to be meaningful for the families and the child, really. And with this, we are trying to find out what measure and how can we find the measure that are meaningful. So at the moment, this is really, we're still looking at this data, and we are hoping for some more input really from families about this area. And I'm going to stop here for now, and I'm happy to answer more questions later about this, and I'm kind of conscious about the time, but I just really wanted to give an overview, a general overview of what we've been doing with the family and why really it's important to engage families with our research. And really, I just want to thank Liz, Cathy for the opportunity to do this, and obviously, of course, the families that have kind of took part and engaged with this project. And I've really enjoyed it, running this project.
Thank you, Rina. Yeah, no, it's so good that you doing this piece of work. So when researchers like Cathy and Rina want to start applying for bigger grants to do these big studies, it's really important that they engage with families and they, as Rina said, find out, you know, although the measures, the numbers might look better, does the life change? Do you guys find your lives are better? So it's so important that, you know, when you follow our page and we share a call for research involvement, that if you can be involved, you know, we just really welcome you to be involved. And we're showing how nice and friendly these researchers are as well. So nothing to be afraid of, right, Rina?
No, absolutely. And
okay.
I mean, it's very, at least for me, and I love doing all of the engagement project with the families, and listening to what the families really want is very important from kind of our research point of view, really. So, and to
Awesome.
improve the quality of our work as well.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, right. So hang on and I'll get you involved in the questions later, but I'm going to welcome up on stage our next speaker, Lizzie. Oh, you've disappeared. I want to spotlight your video, Lizzie. There we go.
Can you see me? I'm giving you a wave.
Yes, lovely. And remove Rina from the stage. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Lizzie Hill. So Lizzie is a registered polysomnographic technologist. I managed to say it. And you are also a tutor. So you teach other clinicians about how to do sleep studies, how to run it. And we especially like you because you did PhD research in sleep apnea in people with Down syndrome. So you've also got a little bit of a heart for our community as well. So we're so happy that you were able to come and be a part of this webinar. You are based in Oxford, but I'm sure you from your accent, have worked in other places as well. So I'm going to hand over the stage to you and let you tell us all about how do these issues present in adults?
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction and for inviting me along today. Now, I am mindful of the fact that we do have to get some questions in, so I will speak quite quickly. But can everyone see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you very much again for having me along. My name is Lizzie Hill. My background is as a sleep physiologist, but I now work full-time as a lecturer at the University of Oxford. But my research interest, as you mentioned, is in adults with Down syndrome, and I'll touch on some of that work today. So after a very brief introduction, I'll touch on sleep and mental health problems in adults with Down syndrome. I'll mention sleep and dementia, and I'll focus mainly on obstructive sleep apnea. And of course, Cathy has already done a lot of the hard work for me because there are a lot of parallels in obstructive sleep apnea between adults and children. And as I've said, I want to make sure that we do have some time for questions, so I will press on. So I'm sure you're all very aware that there is a problem in Down syndrome generally with diagnostic overshadowing. And people with Down syndrome, as Cathy has already highlighted, can really experience the full range of sleep disorders that we see in anyone else. So there are a lot of different sleep disorders out there, but in people with Down syndrome, these are quite often overlooked because of diagnostic overshadowing. So there might be a bias where there's this belief that people with Down syndrome is the main problem rather than any of the other problems that we come across. And there can be, unfortunately, a lack of understanding and some misconceptions, particularly around sleep problems. So there are many people who believe that people with Down syndrome just don't sleep well and that it's just part of the condition. But as I hope Cathy has already highlighted, and hopefully I'll cover as well, just because someone has Down syndrome doesn't mean that we can't diagnose a sleep problem, and it doesn't mean that we don't treat. So it might be more difficult to access treatment sometimes or to spot the symptoms, but always we take the person first and we look at the underlying problem from there. And as Cathy has already mentioned, sleep problems are very prevalent in children with Down syndrome, but they're also very common in adults. And Rebecca Storrs in Portsmouth, did some really nice work where she did an online survey of 100 parents and carers of adults with Down syndrome. And she found that nearly half had some sort of behaviourally based sleep problem. And of those people who had a behavioural sleep problem, about a quarter of them had sleep apnea. And so we'll come back to sleep apnea just in a moment. But what's important here is that despite half of the responders having some sort of sleep problem, only 15 out of that 100 people were actually receiving any treatment. And that's a very common scenario that we see. And I won't read all of this out, but there were some really nice quotes in Rebecca's paper from families who were experiencing problems with sleep in adults with Down syndrome. And I'm sure all of you on the call are aware that it doesn't just affect the person themselves, it affects the whole family, the parents, the carers, the siblings. And so there are a lot of nice quotes in there that explain just how challenging it can be to deal with someone who isn't sleeping well and how that affects the whole family. And in terms of the consequences of poor sleep in adults with Down syndrome, then again, these are exactly the same as we see in the typically developing population. So we see excessive sleepiness in the daytime. So everyone has a background level of sleepiness. There is a threshold where that becomes excessive. We can quite often see behavioural and emotional disturbances in people who are sleepy. We see changes in mood and mental health, and we can see problems with daytime functioning in terms of learning, memory, and so on. But as Cathy already highlighted, she mentioned the concept of a cognitive reserve. So people with Down syndrome who already have perhaps an intellectual disability or a problem with learning, then receive this double hit by being affected by poor sleep as well. So people who are already vulnerable to the effects of sleep, problems can be sort of double hit by poor sleep. And that then, I've mentioned briefly about mental health problems and the link with low mood and problems with mood disturbances. And there was a really nice paper a few years ago which highlighted this quite nicely. So this was a team in America who went back through all the cases that they'd seen in their clinic. They identified 28 people, 28 adults, young adults with Down syndrome who had a major depressive episode. So they met the clinical criteria for major depression. And when they did sleep studies on these people, they found that 86% of them had obstructive sleep apnea that hadn't previously been identified. And that was compared with a control group of adults with Down syndrome who didn't have depression, who also had sleep studies. Only 4% of that control group had obstructive sleep apnea. So I think that highlights quite nicely the link between obstructive sleep apnea, poor sleep, and mood problems, and the fact that these aren't always picked up routinely. Of course, you'll also be aware that adults with Down syndrome experience early onset Alzheimer's-like dementia. And you can see on the right-hand side here, the spread from the age of about 30 onwards, adults with Down syndrome will start to be diagnosed with dementia. And there's some nice work that was done by the same group in Arizona, who Cathy mentioned earlier, who found that having obstructive sleep apnea, ignore the HS there, I meant to take that out, but having sleep apnea can speed up the cognitive decline that adults with Down syndrome already experience. So that early onset dementia can actually be exacerbated by untreated sleep apnea. And one of the reasons for that, it can be to do with the drops in the oxygen levels, but also the fragmented sleep can disrupt clearance of toxins from the brain. And one of the sort of growth areas in sleep medicine generally at the moment is the link between sleep and dementia. And part of this stems from the discovery of the glymphatic system, which is basically a waste clearance system in the brain. So this is a system that washes out all the toxins from the brain, which includes the toxins that build up when someone has Alzheimer's dementia. And the most important thing here is that that system is more active when we're asleep than when we're awake. And it's particularly more active during deep sleep, or stage N3 sleep as we call it. And that deep sleep is the sleep where we're doing our growing, our developing, and so on, as Cathy already mentioned. And the discovery of this waste clearance system has been really quite a big deal in the sleep world. So if you think of this as taking out the trash while we're asleep. And so of course, if we have someone who isn't sleeping well or whose sleep is very broken, so for example, if they have obstructive sleep apnea, then that may well disrupt this clearance system. And that might be part of the mechanism that causes this speeding up of the dementia that we see in adults with Down syndrome. And this is just a nice colourful picture. Don't worry about the details, but the important thing here is that as we get older, and this is the general population, as well as people with Down syndrome, we have these vessels in our brain, these spaces around our blood vessels where we flush out all the toxins, and these pink and yellow bits here are all the toxins being flushed back out of the brain. As we get older, it doesn't work quite so well. And what happens in people with Alzheimer's disease is that we get buildup of some of these waste products that just don't then get flushed out. And these enlarged perivascular spaces can result in both Alzheimer's disease, but also in vascular dementia, which is another area that I have an interest in terms of typically developing adults, which I don't have time to talk about today. But there is some evidence that in the general population, people who have obstructive sleep apnea also have these enlarged perivascular spaces, which might have an impact in terms of dementia further down the line. Okay, I'm aware that I'm going very, very quickly, but hopefully you're still all on board. And if anyone does have any specific questions, I can address those afterwards. Okay, so moving on to obstructive sleep apnea. So Cathy's already given us a really nice overview of OSA in children, and it's very, very similar in adults. So this is a really nice picture here taken from the British Lung Foundation website, which I'll mention later, which really just shows us how the air usually travels in and out through your lungs, into your lungs and back out again, no problem. But when your airway collapses, you're trying to breathe against a closed airway and the air just physically can't get through. And as Cathy already mentioned, people with Down syndrome are at an increased risk of obstructive sleep apnea because there's an overlap between some of the physical features of Down syndrome and the risk factor for sleep apnea. So that includes the shape of the face, a tendency to be overweight or obese, and having a very small or crowded airway, and also the floppy muscles that we already mentioned, which are much worse when we're in our dreaming stage of sleep. So all of these things work together to result in closure of the airway and a higher risk of obstructive sleep apnea. And there are some screening guidelines. They're not very formalized guidelines, but many of you who have adults or young people with Down syndrome will be aware of the health book, which is produced by the Down Syndrome Association. And certainly within the health book, there is a recommendation that GPs ask about sleep at every annual health check. And there is some information online available for GPs and for interested relatives, which I was involved in writing a few years ago now, which is available to sort of give some information about sleep problems, not just obstructive sleep apnea. But beyond this, there isn't really much guidance formally in terms of screening adults for obstructive sleep apnea. So it may be that you do have to bring this up yourself when you're attending a health check, when you're attending an appointment for another reason, or if you have any suspicion that the young person or adult that you care for has some symptoms of sleep apnea. So just be aware that you might have to bring this up yourself rather than your GP or your specialist mentioning it to you. So what do we do in terms of diagnosing? So as Cathy's already mentioned, there are ways that we can run sleep studies either at home or in a sleep centre. And this gentleman here is one of the participants from my PhD study who's kindly allowed me to use his picture. And this just gives an example of one type of home sleep study where we have a recording device with some bands around the chest and the tummy to measure breathing movements. He has a little clip on his finger to measure oxygen levels, and he would normally have a tube at his nose as well to measure breathing. And as part of my research that I conducted for my PhD, we, myself and some colleagues, had a great time traveling around the country, visiting lots of people with Down syndrome in their homes, being very welcome all over the country, and setting people up with this equipment to use at home. And we found that most people, and we visited 152 people in total, we found that most people had a usable study after 1 or 2 nights of recording. Some people, for various reasons, it took a little bit longer, but we managed to get usable data in 149 out of those 152 people. And so 1 or 2 nights of recording generally seems to be sufficient. There are other types of sleep study where you might have to come into hospital and have some wires attached to the head as well. That's called a polysomnography, and I'll come back to that in a moment. You can also have a test that's just the finger clip, which measures oxygen levels. And Cathy's done some really nice work using that type of technology in children with Down syndrome, which has already been covered. Now, already mentioned as well was a scale called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, and it's commonly used to measure how sleepy someone is. And I mentioned already about excessive daytime sleepiness, and quite often we would measure that threshold using the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. But what we found, myself and some colleagues did some work with this a few years back now, what we found is when you use this questionnaire, and we used a pictorial version of this questionnaire with adults with Down syndrome, not all the questions are appropriate. So some of the questions ask things about, sitting quietly after lunch when circumstances permit, lying down quietly after lunch when circumstances permit. And what we found was that most of the people that we spoke to had really busy lives. They were out every day doing all sorts of things. They might have been in employment, they might have been in education, they might have been at day centres and so on. And very few people actually had the chance to lie down in the afternoon. We also found that the question around sitting and reading was often not completed or had been missed out because given that some people have problems with literacy or low literacy levels, then perhaps reading wasn't the best question to ask. Perhaps it would be better to ask about looking at a book or using a tablet, for instance. So some of the scores on the Epworth scale might be artificially low in people with Down syndrome, and it might be that there are other signs of sleepiness that are more important. So things like challenging behaviour, changes in emotion or mood problems might be more important than that number on the Epworth sleepiness scale. And that's something that hasn't really been picked up by sleep labs. So when you turn up at your consultant, you might just be given one of these questionnaires anyway. And if you score quite low on that questionnaire, you might not progress to a sleep study. So just be aware that scores can be slightly low on this questionnaire. Now, I mentioned polysomnography, which is the sleep study where we have wires on the head that measure brain waves and tell us whether someone's awake or asleep. And in terms of prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea in adults with Down syndrome, there are a variety of different numbers based on different studies. What you will notice here is that most of these studies have very small numbers of participants. So we have a study here, one of the larger ones has 54 participants, but some of the other studies only have 6 or 16. But what you will see is that when we use polysomnography, and there are lots of different cutoffs we can use, there are very high rates of obstructive sleep apnea in adults with Down syndrome. So anywhere between 60 and 88%, depending on the cutoff you use. And when we use an Epworth sleepiness scale score of more than 10, you can see that the number here is slightly lower than when we just look at the results from the polysomnography. So that ties in again to what I've just mentioned about the Epworth perhaps not being the most sensitive tool that we can use. The work that I did for my PhD, we had 2 parts to the study. So first we asked people using a questionnaire to rate their own symptoms and sleepiness. And then the second part was the home sleep study that I've already mentioned. And we had over 1,000 people respond to the questionnaire. There may be some of you on the call, and if there are, thank you very much for taking part. And we found that about 35% of people were likely to have OSA based on their responses on the questionnaire. But that was in contrast to about 9% of the people who were likely to have OSA had actually been diagnosed. So again, a very low level of diagnosis in adults with Down syndrome. And in terms of the objective study data from the home sleep studies, we found a prevalence of almost 50%. And so that seems quite high, not as high as we had on the previous slide, but when we compare that to the general population, this is the worldwide population of obstructive sleep apnea and typically developing adults based on a variety of different cutoffs, but generally using standard cutoffs, it's only up to about 25% of the population would have sleep apnea. So it's almost double in adults with with Down syndrome, sorry. So what can we do about it? This is the big one. And Cathy's already touched on a lot of this, but the treatment is slightly different in adults and children. So we've talked about removing the tonsils and adenoids being the first line therapy in children. It's not often a first line in adults unless there are particularly enlarged adenoids and tonsils. But the problem is that there is some evidence that it's less effective in people with Down syndrome. And this is from a study in children from a number of years ago. Most of the studies are in children because that's when the surgery tends to be done. And what you can see here is this little sort of light blue bit of the pie here. Only about a quarter of children who had tonsils and adenoids removed for obstructive sleep apnea didn't require any further treatment. Some needed to move on to CPAP, so over half moved on to CPAP, and about 18% had oxygen therapy. And what's not shown here is how many people had to have tonsils and adenoids done again. And it's important to remember that even though you've had T's and A's removed, they can start to grow back. So that's worth having reassessed as well. We did some work around this in Edinburgh as well. And this was again from our same questionnaire study. And what we found was that adults who reported that they'd had adenoids and tonsils removed were significantly sleepier than those who hadn't, and also had more excessive daytime sleepiness, were more likely to have symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea, and had higher rates of behavioural disturbances reported on the questionnaire as well. So there is some evidence that even though that treatment has been conducted, it's not always fully successful, or it may be successful initially, but not carried on in the longer term. So it is worth bearing in mind that even though your young person has already had treatment for obstructive sleep apnea, they might need to be reassessed again and the symptoms can reoccur. So in terms of adults, the first line therapy for moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea is CPAP. And this is one of the young men who took part in my study. So again, a thank you to him for allowing me to use his photo. But this is the first line treatment in typically developing adults. It's also a treatment that's used for residual obstructive sleep apnea in children who've had adenoid tonsillectomy but still have symptoms. But as Cathy already mentioned, there's really very little evidence in people with Down syndrome as to the effectiveness of this treatment. So just to finish up on the last few slides, because I know that we're over time already, this was again from the PhD work that I did. So after we'd done the home sleep studies, we identified 28 individuals, 2/3 of whom were male, who were happy to take part in a trial of CPAP. They were all young adults. About 3/4 of the participants were overweight or obese, and the Epworth sleepiness scores were broadly in the normal to slightly abnormal range. Everyone that took part had a moderate or severe intellectual disability, and we didn't have any significant differences between the men and women in the study. And the sort of bottom line version of this is that after 12 months on CPAP, we found that there were significant improvements in sleepiness, in behaviour, in emotional disturbances, and also in some aspects of cognitive function. So there is some evidence there in a very small group of participants over a relatively short period of time that CPAP can be effective and can be tolerated in adults with Down syndrome. At the end of the study, 19 out of the 28 remained on CPAP. Some of the reasons for discontinuing were problems with tolerating the equipment, not perceiving a benefit. We had some families that, although their young person was responding, didn't want to continue with the treatment for whatever reason. And we had some participants who were in residential care who didn't really have the support from their carers, unfortunately, to continue on the treatment. But I think it's very promising that 19 young people remained on treatment, were quite happy with the results, and that we did have some significant measurable improvements there. But of course, further research is required. This is a very small group of people. And as Cathy's already mentioned, and will mention again and again, there's so little evidence out there in people with Down syndrome that there's always further work for us to do. So it's great to have people like the Down Syndrome Research Foundation supporting us and encouraging us to do that work. And it's also great to have people like yourselves on the call who hopefully are engaged in taking part in this type of study going forward. So finally, some tips for treatment in adults with Down syndrome. I mentioned that some people struggle with compliance, and there can be a preconception, unfortunately, from healthcare providers that people with Down syndrome just don't comply with CPAP. But if you do it properly, it can work. So it's worth making sure that you have plenty of time for the CPAP initiation, and time's not something that we always have in clinic, but we may need to find ways to build more time in. So having plenty of time to get started on CPAP, not rushing the process. You might need to have a longer initiation session, or you might have to have multiple sessions. There are desensitization techniques that we can use, so allowing the person with Down syndrome to explore the equipment in their own time and their own surroundings where they feel comfortable. You might want to build up use of the mask over time, so we don't expect people to just put it on and have a full night's sleep straight away. We might just have to build up some time using the mask initially with the machine switched off or not even attached to the machine. And if someone's really sensitive to the equipment, we might need to use distraction techniques. So having some favorite music playing, all the things that Cathy said aren't good for getting off to sleep, they might be good for getting used to using the mask in the daytime. So having some music to distract you, watching your favorite TV program, having a friend or a relative or a carer in the room to chat to the person while they get used to using the mask before they start to use it at night. And one thing that could be really helpful is peer support, whether that be through a Down syndrome support group, whether that be something that's set up by the sleep clinic or something that you instigate yourself with other people that you know who have relatives with Down syndrome. And I'd just like to direct you finally to a really nice resource. So the Advocate Medical Group Adult Down Syndrome Centre in the US have some really nice resources that are free to use. I've put the YouTube link here and we can post it in the chat as well. But they have some really nice videos that are filmed with people with Down syndrome, teaching other people with Down syndrome how to use their CPAP equipment and so on. And these are really nice peer support resources that can help the person to engage with the treatment more fully when they see someone like themselves using it. That can be a really powerful tool to try and encourage compliance. So at this point, I'll stop. Just to summarise, sleep problems, including OSA, are very common in adults with Down syndrome. Questions about sleep should always be included at an annual health check, but diagnosis and treatment really isn't as commonplace as it should be for a variety of reasons that we've already discussed. It's worth remembering that removing the tonsils and adenoids is quite often effective initially, but might not be sustained into adulthood. So do think about getting a further referral if symptoms have recurred. CPAP can be very effective when the appropriate support is provided. And I think as healthcare professionals, that's where we have to make sure that we do our job to provide as much support as we can, including educational materials in adequate, accessible formats. And there's a lot of work still to be done, but there is some promising evidence here that we can have significant improvements in sleepiness, daytime function, and behaviour in adults with Down syndrome. I did mention that British Lung Foundation website. This is also worth having a look at. It's aimed at the general population, but all the principles apply to everyone, whether they have Down syndrome or not. And it's a really nice website that has lots of evidence-based information about diagnosis, treatment, how to approach your GP, and so on. So I would definitely recommend having a look at that if you're concerned in any way or want some support. So I didn't go quite as quickly as I hoped I would. I hope there are still some people on the call and there's still some time for questions. If there's any questions that we don't get through today, I'm happy for you to contact me either through Twitter or via email. But thanks again for listening. Thanks again for having me along. And yeah, hopefully we can answer any questions that you might have now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. That was wonderful. And I just think you hit on some really important things. I am always banging on about diagnostic overshadowing. So thank you for mentioning that. I think I dropped a hint, did I? But yeah, it is a big issue. So I'll give you 5 minutes to have a drink there, Lizzie, while we talk to our pediatric colleagues and think a little bit. Parents are asking, in the same way that the British Lung Foundation have a great little site to talk about sleep apnea, is there somewhere that parents can go to learn about general sleep tips? Obviously, Super Nanny has her videos on YouTube, but what do you guys, where do you send your parents to learn about those behaviors that maybe help them get them kids to sleep?
Yeah, so there are a couple of really excellent websites. Neither of them, to my shame, are UK based actually. But for the younger child, there's a great website called babysleep.com, really simple, babysleep.com. And that was, do you remember I said there was this wonderful inspirational psychologist, Jodie Mindell in Brown University, who did that piece of research with me looking at sleep behaviors. She was the kind of inspiration behind this website. So she got really worried that there were lots of kind of private sleep coaches out there who were giving kind of maybe quite biased advice, maybe not always evidence-based and research-based. So she got together a whole bunch of kind of sleep experts from around the world to produce this website, but it's very interactive. It's got loads of videos, loads of sleep tips. It is primarily for the 0 to 3s, but what I would say is that lots of the advice works really, really well, certainly for preschool children up to the age of 5, and it covers all the topics. It covers all the sleep disorders, as well as kind of normal sleep, lots of good tips around sleep hygiene, etc. The other one, which is great, is raisingchildren. I think it's just .au. It's an Australian website. Raising Children, maybe it's raisingchildren.net.au, one or the other. I can look it up. I don't know, Liz, whether you can pop it around to people.
Christine's popping
as we speak, yeah. And that's fantastic. And they've got, again, sort of supported by sleep researchers, decent, sensible advice by age, which is kind of nice. So they've got preschool, school age, teenage, and they cover a whole lot of stuff, not just sleep, it's behavior and diet and all the kind of decent, good know-how for parenting is there. And I think language works quite well. I think translates well, doesn't it, from Australia to the UK and culture.
I'm married to an Aussie. I just about understand him.
Yeah. Yeah, but they're good. They're both good resources.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll get a British resource going one of these days.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, so that's great in terms of giving people them tips to get going. We obviously in our community, there's a lot of issues sometimes with the digestive tract, airway kind of issues where, you know, we've got some medically complex children who have Down syndrome as well. how do you kind of, do you always assume that these kids need to see someone like you, a specialist, you know, just to kind of make sure that there's
Yeah,
good airway at
well,
night?
I think the sleep apnea question is sort of universal, isn't it? You know, we've seen how incredibly prevalent it is. So I think, you know, the idea of screening, sort of universal screening, the idea that all children at some point should have a check, should have a sleep study, and that should probably be repeated through childhood and into adult life because we know that it persists. So I think that's a kind of given. In terms of sort of wider sleep problems, if you've excluded sleep apnea, I think there is a lot of merit in using some of these good sleep habits and basic behavioral approaches. And if that's because, you know, within the community, there are a lot of people who can advise about that. So, you know, health visiting services, we're very privileged, aren't we, in the UK to have health visiting services. Most of them have nursery nurses that work with them, that often do pieces of work with families. You've then got your public health nurses within the sort of school arena. And, you know, we run training from Southampton, and we're training, you know, like 160 people this year around sort of sleep problems. So I know that around the country, there are more and more people gaining expertise, and there are other courses around the country too that offer similar training to professionals. So more and more people are getting confident around sleep. I think the other bit of the diagnostic overshadowing is the professional anxiety. So I think I do have the situation where, you know, health visitors, for example, might go, oh gosh, no, this child's got something different, so the normal stuff doesn't apply. And that's why I said children with Down syndrome are children first, because a lot of these basic techniques work. You know, I see a lot of children who've got all the way to a tertiary clinic. They've waited a year to see me, but actually at the core of all of this is a standard chronic insomnia that is no different to another child. I mean, how it became a problem may be slightly different. I think, you know, I see this again and again when, you know, families have had a difficult journey, particularly if that first year has been difficult. And it may be around, you know, medical problems and so on, then it all kind of gets a bit lost. So I think there's something, isn't there, about having something bespoke, I think, you know, and I showed you those websites that were developing digital interventions for children with ADHD and ASD, and, you know, something like that was very bespoke for children with Down syndrome, I think would perhaps be a really useful self-help. And I'm not aware of anything like that out there. Lizzie, I don't know if you're aware of anything, or
No,
Liz,
I mean,
if you've heard of anything.
No.
I know that there are, you know, obviously there's a lot of online platforms out there for the general public, but whether they are specifically focused to Down syndrome or even accessible, I don't know.
Because there's something very powerful, isn't there, about this applies to my child, and there's something very undermining about this is for everybody else, but not for my child. Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes you do almost have to get to a specialist level to sort of unpick that and say, actually, no, at the core of this is the child. But, you know, that's not neglecting the fact, of course, that if you get stuck, then yes, I think specialist assessment is definitely warranted. And across the UK now, I mean, sleep medicine is just such an exciting field, and it's really progressing. So we're just now talking with the College of Paediatrics about developing basic training for paediatricians, so that in each hospital there will be a paediatrician who understands sleep. You haven't got to just come to one of 3 or 4 big centres around the country. You know, you get to, you know, you go to your local hospital and there'll be somebody who understands the basics. So, and that's all happening at the moment. I think the reality is, for a lot of people, you may not have a huge amount of expertise around you, but I would definitely say, don't be afraid of looking at some of the basics.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Parents asking for how to cope with poor sleep themselves.
Yeah. And actually, I think, you know, one of the really important starting points when we do any piece of work with family is looking at competency. And I don't mean intellectual competency or anything like that, you know, everyday life competency, just about how realistic and possible is it to do this piece of work right now with this parent and with this child. Because if you're completely exhausted as an adult, what does that do to you? I'd say 2/3 of the time at least, it makes you more anxious. It might make you depressed. It'll affect your mood. So to say to parents, okay, you know, we'd like to do this piece of work with your child who, you know, might possibly get upset. You've had a difficult journey already with this child and you're feeling exhausted. You know, that is a really tall order. So a lot of, I think often the sort of first step is that self-care, isn't it? About saying, okay, how can we get to the point where we can help our child? And sometimes that might be about, you know, calling in anybody around you who can help.
All in the troops.
You know, all the troops, grandparents, siblings. I mean, that's a bit hard in COVID, isn't it? But, you know, getting help in to make these things possible. Sometimes it might be around addressing mood disorder. If, you know, if people have found themselves in a position where they're feeling really low, it's about addressing that so that you can take the next step on. And it because you're in this vicious cycle sometimes, aren't you, of no sleep, you know, becoming more and more tired, becoming more and more low, and it then becomes very difficult to get out of that. So sometimes it's about treating yourself almost before you can help your child.
Yes, put on your own oxygen mask first, as they say on the plane.
Yeah, really good analogy. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the parents is asking, interesting, do we have research that shows some of our kids do end up on oxygen, supplemental oxygen during the day, maybe due to hypotonia or other issues? Is it predictive that they'll have apnea, or do we just not know that those kiddos
they're going to be more vulnerable? I'm trying to think.
Okay.
I'm Lizzie might know. I've not seen any research. I don't think, Rina, in our however many thousands of papers we looked at, there was anything on daytime oxygen. But I think for sure there's going to be more vulnerability. So I think any child who's needing oxygen in the day should be having a proper overnight sleep study. And I think that would involve at least what Lizzie was demonstrating with the tummy bands and the kind of tubes under the nose and things, rather than just a pulse oximetry.
I think also, sorry, Cathy. I think also we said with what we've seen with the CPAP studies for the systematic review, that actually the quality of the studies in CPAP in children, it wasn't very good. And there's not very many studies that look at this in children. So
lots of question marks.
Definitely.
One for you, Lizzie. Is there an upper age limit on sleep studies for our adults?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And one thing that I didn't really speak about very much is that the risk of sleep apnea increases as we get older. And that applies to people with Down syndrome and people without. As we get older, our muscle tone tends to reduce. So again, people with Down syndrome are starting from perhaps a more vulnerable airway anyway. But as you get older, the vulnerability of the airway increases. So absolutely no, there's no upper limit. And in fact, as you get older, it might even be more important to keep checking. Whether that's easily accessible in terms of sleep labs and so on, it's hard to say. But certainly, as far as I'm concerned, there's absolutely no. I mean, I wouldn't turn someone away from a sleep clinic because they were too old to have a sleep study. Definitely not.
Good to hear it. So there you go, the parent that asked that question. Well, you touched a little bit, because it's your sort of area of expertise, Lizzie, about getting our loved ones used to wearing the mask, and some of the tips you gave about playing with the getting used to the actual equipment. Would that apply to sort of the pediatric, the kiddos? Same sort of tips, getting them used to the mask? As
far as I'm aware, then yes. I mean, Cathy will have much more experience in this possibly than I do. What I would say, I didn't really put it in my slides, but there's a psychologist called Lina Patel, who's based in the States, who has some really nice resources around desensitization protocols for CPAP, but also for wearing glasses, for wearing hearing aids. I think if you Google it, it's freely available. I can certainly have a look and pass it on. I meant to put it in my slides and then didn't get round to it, but there's some really nice information online from Dr. Patel in terms of desensitization protocols for children. But my understanding is that those techniques will work with anyone. It's about just sort of building confidence slowly on the individual's own terms to some extent. And then, of course, you can add in things like reward charts, star charts, whatever's going to get that engagement and buy-in. But I don't know, Cathy, Rina, do you have other tips to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I run the more neurological side of our sleep service. I don't run the respiratory side. So I don't have as much first-hand experience of, prescribing the CPAP and sort of following it through. I know that really key in our service are the specialist nurses, the non-invasive ventilation specialist nurses. I mean, they do a lot of work with families to, do all the things you've talked about, Lizzie, the sort of desensitization and gradually introducing children to it. And certainly I'm just thinking about what we've got in the systematic review and the research. I think, I guess what we're not really sure about is, how much compliance do you need to make a difference in children? I think that's a really interesting area, because is 4 hours enough, or, would 2 hours even be quite helpful? And I guess it depends a bit when in the night it's happening, doesn't it? But I think probably in principle anything's going to be. Did your data show that, Lizzie, with the adults?
Yeah, so it was quite interesting. That's what I was just going to say, was the general compliance, so the average compliance, or the number of hours that the machine was used overall, was really quite low in our study. It was, from memory, it was just under 4 hours, I think. We did have some people who were using 9 hours a night. We had some people who were only using 1 or 2. But even with that really quite low compliance, or modest compliance, let's say, we did still see some significant improvement. So I would suspect that getting some good quality sleep is better than getting no good quality sleep.
I think that's right. Yeah.
I've popped the link for Lena Patel's work into the chat. But yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I would say about compliance and building compliance is, like most things, just perseverance. And as Cathy was saying, it can be quite hard to persevere with these types of things when you're already chronically sleep deprived, whether you're the individual themselves or a parent, carer, family member. But yeah, sort of persevering and not saying, well, we tried it and it didn't work. It can be a long process and a quite a difficult process. But I think if you take the time, it can work. So I would say, it's difficult, but just keep trying.
Yeah, so I think there's been a couple of questions about that, going in and having to put it back on, going in and having to put it. So maybe it's more a matter of actually, let's just have a block of time that we gradually try to increase, rather than actually have this ridiculous sort of super high bar that, is unattainable, with actually you have to function as well. So kind of making a realistic, very slow, gradual kind of building.
What I would also say is, be aware that sometimes, the first mask you get fitted with might not be the best one. Sometimes you need a change of mask. Sometimes you need a different size or a different style. So, don't be afraid to go back to your healthcare provider and, say, maybe this mask's too big or it's too small. Or one thing that I did find with my study was that masks are not designed for the specific facial features of people with Down syndrome. They tend to be too long. They don't tend to sit very comfortably. And that's perhaps something that needs to be addressed by the equipment manufacturers as well. But yeah, just be aware that, it's not a one size fits all. There are lots of different styles of masks out there and different sizes, and you might need to try a few before you find one that works.
Just to update everyone, my brother, actually, if he meets his number of hours, and he'll let me know in the morning when he comes down, he has a little reward as a shandy with his dinner. And actually his mask shape, he had to go from an adult male, smart adult male, to the female, just to shape, just to get, because he's got a beard as well. So that's working against that seal. But he's actually very comfortable now to put that on, and he's quite pleased with himself. He checks. And one of the great things about the company is that it will send you an email when you've had a great, sort of run of nights, and it'll give you a gold kind of gold award because you've done great on your sleep machine. So, there's lots of ways to kind of build in encouragement and find something that the adult wants to do that you can encourage them with. So we have someone who's kind of has an adolescent who's about to have those T's and A's, about to have the tonsils and adenoids out. Do we know that, what sort of success rate we can expect with she also has apnea? Can we expect that she'll have a reasonable amount of success to get rid of the apnea, or do we just not know?
I think on an individual basis, that's quite tricky, because I guess it depends on all the other factors. I think, if she doesn't have any weight problems, if her tone's not too bad, then, and if they're big, if there's a big tonsils and adenoids, then yeah, there's a reasonable chance there's a good chance that will help. But I think some of the or the challenge, I guess, is for us to be able to develop sort of more bespoke advice, you know, not just, oh, okay, you've got sleep apnea, you've got Down syndrome, you have an adenotonsillectomy, but more, okay, let's have a look at all the other factors in the mix for this one particular individual. Is this the right solution? And one of the things that I think was very interesting in the literature is the increasing use of something called drug-induced sleep endoscopy, or I think it's called DICE or DISE, isn't it? I'm not sure how the ENT surgeons pronounce it, but I think more and more ENT centers are doing this now. So rather than just have a one-size-fits-all, take your tonsils out, you actually make somebody sleepy with drugs and then do an endoscopy. So put a little tube down the back of the nose into the airway and actually look and see where the obstruction is happening. So instead of just taking the tonsils out, you say, well, actually, it's not the tonsils, it's somewhere else that's the problem. So that's where we need to direct our surgery. So that's the more kind of bespoke surgical advice, surgical route. And there are some interesting, quite recent papers that have looked at outcomes with that. But I think, you know, as Rina said, not enough data out there yet to sort of give a very specific direction. But I suspect that's the way that things will be going, that we have more bespoke surgical approaches. I suspect that UK-wide it's still a little bit one size fits all, because you know every centre will do adenotonsillectomies. You know, and you know, for some children it does debulk the airway, but I think the important thing is that the airway is checked again post-operatively. You know, not to just think, oh, great, you know, sorted. It's important that children have a follow-up sleep study, particularly in this group of children. Because we do know that they're much more vulnerable to it not working. So you need to have the before and the after sleep studies.
I think that's something that's missing for a lot of people. They sort of go through this major surgery, and that's can feel like profound. Okay, we've done it, and that's sort of treated. But you've got to remind the clinicians, if they haven't already suggested it, go back in, please check that it's now resolved. So we'll take one more question, and then maybe I'll get you guys to give your kind of closing thoughts, because you've just stayed on so long. I've appreciated it. So we've got some parents that are wondering about sleep terrors, and actually, you know, is sleep terror something that affects children with Down syndrome, and when does that kind of happen in the general population as well?
Yeah, so sleep terrors are incredibly common. You know, around 40% of children, all of us at some point in our life may have one. When they become problematic, as if they're kind of every night or multiple nights a week, they're actually a phenomena of deep sleep. So the transition from deep sleep, so a true sleep terror will happen usually within 45 minutes or an hour or so of the child falling asleep. They you know, they kind of do what they say on the box, that, you know, they are terrifying to watch. So children will sort of often suddenly sit upright, look like they're possessed. They will scream and shout. They might push a parent away. But I think the most important thing for you to know is that the child is asleep. It doesn't look like they're asleep. They're in a mixed brain state where, I'm sure Lizzie will have seen this in the sleep labs over the years. You know, it's fascinating. You can see that most of the brain, the thinking brain, is sailing along in deep sleep, while the emotional brain is having a bit of a hoolie, you know, and some of the motor parts of the brain are still working, so children can shout and scream and wave their arms around and what have you. And I think one of the hardest things in the world to do is just step back, because actually if you start interacting with a child and being overly involved, that can tend to prolong them. It's incredibly hard to do, you know, because actually all of your instincts are screaming at you to kind of cuddle the child and calm them down. But often that actually backfires a little bit and makes it last a bit longer. So I think, you know, I think it's very difficult to avoid just wanting to put a hand on the child and say something soothing. But I think trying to be as uninvolved as possible and just let it burn out. It's partly genetic. So, you know, you can bet your bottom dollar mum, dad, auntie, somebody's either done sleepwalking or sleep terrors in their past. If you've got that tendency, the next thing that kind of makes you vulnerable is just being a child, because your brain's busy rewiring itself. It kind of happens in a sleep switching stage, and because switching between those graphs that I showed you, all those different sleep stages, is actually quite complicated. You know, all kind of different bits of your brain are lighting up and different chemicals are firing up. So it kind of is not surprising it gets a bit kind of confused and a bit muddled up when your brain is developing and wiring. So children are more vulnerable. And then the next thing to add in the mix is anything that affects your sleep quality. So either not getting enough sleep, if you're just not getting enough hours of sleep, or if your sleep's sort of disrupted by something like apnea or restlessness or something else, that drives the terrors.
Okay.
So more often than not, when I'm seeing children with very resistant sleep terrors in my clinic, I'm saying, what's causing these? And there's something there. It's either apnea or restless legs or something, or they're just going to bed way too late, you know, not getting enough sleep. And once you fix that bit of it, sometimes the terrors just go on their own. I forgot what the question was.
That was it. Yes. Yeah. All about sleep terrors, really.
Yeah.
So if they're not sort of passing after sort of a few months, then maybe it's the time to start asking whether the child maybe needs a sleep study.
Yeah. I mean, very often the very first thing to do is just to make sure they're having optimal sleep. And that alone can just fix it.
Yeah.
In some children, anxiety can set them off. So parents will often say it kind of all got better and then they went to the new school class and it all kicked off at the beginning of term. So, you know, it's not a psychological problem. You know, lovely, happy, psychologically robust children have sleep terrors. It's not the cause, but if you've got sleep terrors, then being anxious can make them a wee bit worse. So I think the main thing as a parent is to not interpret it as your child being disturbed because they look jolly disturbed, and also don't talk about it in the morning, you know, because can you imagine the child will remember nothing, you know, they are amnesic. That's the really defining feature of these. Totally different from bad dreams. You know, bad dreams, the child wakes up, they're frightened, they'll tell you what they're dreaming about, you can calm them down, it's gone. With sleep terrors, if you wake them up, they feel really frightened because their heart's racing and they're in this kind of arousal state that is perceived in their body as fear, but they have no clue what they're frightened about. You know, if you're looking at them saying, what's happened? What are you dreaming about? They might make something up just to kind of, but very often they do then become afraid because the parent looks so afraid. You know, they're waking up with this heart racing and terrified looking parent, and that is pretty fear inducing for the child. So the calmer that you parents can be, and don't talk about it in the morning, because that then may make the child fearful about going to bed and wondering what these funny things are that are happening at night. And if they get super stuck, there are some clever little techniques you can do. But actually, I think babysleep.com might have that. I saw that somebody had posted earlier up in the chat about the Sleep Charity, which is a great organisation. They may well have some stuff on their website as well.
Yeah, and a Scope has a special section as well.
Yeah, the Scope Charity has done some fantastic work over the years with sleep practitioners around the country. So if you're lucky and you're in an area with a Scope sleep practitioner, they would be great to get in touch with if you get stuck.
Great. Okay, well, Lizzie, closing thoughts about adults?
I think we just don't know as much as we should do, and we just need more research. We are getting better, I think, at diagnosing and treating, but it's not always based on evidence because the evidence just isn't there. And of course, everything we do should be based on evidence that's, you know, relevant to the individual. And the other thing would be individualization of treatment, treating the person first, not treating the condition, and treating that individual person in a way that works for them. Yeah, I think that's probably my closing thought.
Great. Rina?
I just really wanted to comment on some, because I've seen a lot of questions from parents about self-soothing and kind of approaches to help the children to go to sleep. And then from a psychological point of view, it's very difficult in terms of just because every child is different. So every child has different needs. But there is the Cerebral Center at Birmingham University, and they do a lot of research in general in children and adults with more kind of neurodevelopmental disabilities, but they have a great advice on sleep, and then you can go and have a look, and they have a lot of resources on in general on sleep and kind of more type of behavioral interventions. What Cathy said earlier about kind of sleep hygiene, like routine and doing the same things, is really useful in general for children. And as a mom as well, I do the same with my daughter. And then sometimes if we do something different, all of the sudden she doesn't go to sleep as well as she won't normally do.
What happens to you as well.
Yeah. So yeah. But yeah, so I think looking at the Cerebral Centre kind of resources, they have a lot of kind of resources for parents in there. You can go and have a look.
Yeah, and they're doing some great work. There's sort of three sort of pillared, and one of them is going to be sleep. With their work with people, children with special needs. So really pleased to support that. Okay, Cathy. Actually, someone's just thrown in the melatonin word.
I thought we got away without it.
We didn't talk about that, but I think we have to kind of maybe, can you mention something about that?
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about your own body's melatonin. We produce natural melatonin at bedtime. I think everything you can do to encourage your child to produce their own. So by, avoiding screens within an hour of bedtime, dimming the lights towards bedtime, that will always help. There's no data that I'm aware of that says that inherently children with Down syndrome have lower melatonin. That is true in some conditions like autism and ADHD. There has been some research showing that. However, still clinicians sometimes would use it as a sort of sleep aid, possibly short term. And I think in my books, if you are sort of up against a wall and you're needing a medical sort of medication as support, then it's probably the most benign amongst them, because it is just replicating what our body does naturally. And there is a new product that's licensed now for children in the UK. The license is for children with autism, and I think probably amongst the group of children with Down syndrome who may perhaps stand to benefit might be that group. But, I would always say, I think I hesitate to talk about it because I think very often the medical model, if you go to see a doctor and say, my child doesn't sleep, the doctors, probably most of them won't have had any training on sleep. Their only kind of resource, if you like, is a medication. And, the guidance is very, very clear in the UK that we shouldn't be using hypnotics for children. I think they need to be only prescribed by people who are expert in sleep, who've really excluded all the other sleep disorders. And frankly, they'll only work if they're used appropriately in that way. But, I think some of you may well have children on melatonin. Hopefully it has been prescribed in that way, by somebody who knows what they're doing and why. Because I think generally it's a very safe and effective drug used in the right children at the right time. So I'm kind of pro, but I'm pro in a very
sort of narrow.
Yeah, in a very targeted way. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it can undermine parents sort of feeling the autonomy that they can do this, that actually you can.
Yeah.
And I, just with my functional medicine doctor hat on, just there's so many things you can do to make sure that bedroom is really sleep conducive, and reducing blue light is just so important.
And I think sometimes there can be a place for medication. Actually, we talked about that sort of vicious cycle when people get really stuck, and how do you get out of that when you're exhausted as a parent. And sometimes we do use medication very short term as a kind of help to get out of that, get out of the hole.
There was a very interesting study about tart cherries. I don't know if you saw that, Cathy. Tart cherries, and actually they stimulate the release of melatonin. So it's cherry season, guys. Maybe that's a good dessert. Make sure those teeth get brushed before bedtime. But yes, tart cherries do stimulate the release of melatonin. So
one comment, actually, Liz, if I'm allowed, I know we're running over time and I talk too much, but one thing I would say is do not overlook parent power. I'm currently applying for money from the National Institute for Health Research, the kind of UK NHS research body, for a slightly different sleep topic, not in Down syndrome. But even though it's a great idea and a great study, and we've got past the first round, they're saying, where is the evidence that parents really want this? So I think having a kind of a body like yourselves actually saying, this is on our agenda, this is important, because they'll say things like, is this in the top 10? How do we know this is actually more important than another topic? Because they could fund any of those topics. And it might not be, or it might, but I in my books, of course, it is, because I'm biased. But I do think that sleep cuts across so much of children's function and development, and also family life, you know, in a way that some other aspects of don't. But
Yeah.
so I think don't underestimate that, and don't underestimate the kind of lobbying and the advocacy. That I think it's such important work you do, Liz.
Oh, thank you. And thank you guys for being willing to give some time this afternoon to speak. I just, again, thank you to you experts.
Pleasure.
And like I said, we have a special place in our heart for people who care about our community and want to spend their research career sort of trying to answer some of these questions and improve the outcomes for our community. So you're very much appreciated. So get the foundations right, guys, and we can move forward and improve sleep for our community. Get behind research. I'm going to be emailing you. I hope most of you don't mind to be joining our email list so that I can tell you more about events like this in the future. But thank you very much, ladies, and good afternoon.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.